So let's talk about senescent cells for a second.
Sure.
So I think this is a twofold issue. With age comes the increase in junk in your bodies, basically. And what that refers to on a cellular level is you have cells in your body that accumulate that don't really do what they're supposed to do, but they also don't self-destruct. So the accumulation of what's called senescent cells. These are cells that are not working properly. They really should die, but they don't apoptose or self-destruct, but at the same time, they're not really performing their essential functions well. So imagine if you start to accumulate all these junk cells in your body, they affect the surrounding cells, and they begin to, they're sort of like, if you're hanging out with the wrong peer group in high school, these are sort of the guys your mom says, don't hang out with those guys. So these senescent cells affect the cells around them. And what animal studies have shown for years now is that if you can just simply get rid of these senescent cells in your body, you get a 10 or 20% life extension in pretty much every animal model that's ever been studied. So people have been wondering for a long time, like, hey, can we use these drugs in humans? And some of these drugs have been known for a long time, and some of these things are supplements, actually. They're over-the-counter, cheap supplements that have a senolytic effect in humans, which means there's a target on senescent cells which can be activated by drugs or supplements that causes that cell that's not working properly to finally self-destruct and go away.
Hey friends, welcome back to another podcast brought to you by our pals over at Redmond Real Salt. Their website is redmond.life. Here's why I like the product. It's hand harvested in the Great Salt Lake region. They're a family-owned business. They've been operating for over 50 years. See, most salts that are out there, some of them come from the ocean, some of them have microplastics, and some of them actually, when they're extracting the salt from the mines, use explosives that can end up in your salt. And so I think the big one is you don't want to have any residual explosive matter or microplastics. This is a real phenomenon. So because of the plastic islands and all the stuff in the ocean, it's ending up in our salt and in our water, which is really crazy. But when you purchase your salt from Redmond Real Salt, you don't have to worry about that. So definitely support our show sponsor, support your body's health. And right now, and I know a lot of people are stockpiling all sorts of crazy things. I recommend loading up on salt because it's something that you will need to ferment, to sprout, to soak, to marinate your meats, and much more. So support your body's health and support your electrolyte balance by going to redmond.life. Cool, Jeff. So we got some gadgets here to talk about.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Where should we go first here?
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could just introduce a conversation that and revisit kind of what we talked about 2 years ago. I think that was 2017, March, I believe. We talked a lot about telomeres. Yeah. And as a proxy to kind of assess longevity and people's biological age. And I feel like a lot of practitioners are still looking at telomeres, but now we have the Horvath clock and these epigenetic clocks, and there's a lot of different intracellular, maybe NAD to NADH ratios. So I feel like this field has evolved when it comes to assessing longevity, and it's something that a lot of people are trying to strive for, optimize, function and longevity, which seem like mutually exclusive concepts at some level. But anyway, right. It's great to be back with you in your clinic here in Portland, Bio Lounge. You got in late last night from Hawaii.
Yeah, I came back from Hawaii, which is always a recharge for anybody who's been to Hawaii, particularly Kauai. It's where I do all my health musings, recharge. Nice. And, there are some folks there that I get to hang out with periodically that are fairly cutting edge in regards to health and fitness. My brother-in-law is one example, who's kind of my health muse, but also people like Laird Hamilton, who I got to spend a couple hours with a few days ago in his sauna in his garage. So a lot of good dialogue happens in the sauna at Laird Hamilton's house, as you can imagine. I come back fairly pumped up, and it's a good reminder being in an environment like that, like what sunshine does, and physical activity and exercise, and aligning yourself around with health-minded and positively minded people, doing yoga every day, eating fresh, good, healthy, organic food, and lots of good fruits and things like that.
Fish and the whole thing. Yeah, like all these intangibles, like social connection and being around, sunlight, like you said, nature. Like, it's funny how we do like to look at like these very objective biomarkers and different supplements and drugs, but it's like there's so much benefit to just living a free life and being connected and being social.
Yeah, I think that's what will be borne out maybe in the next several decades of research is validation that a lot of common sense connection to nature ideas are really keys to health. And I think we can get into this in this talk, but one great example is this, sort of hormetic effect, how applying the right type of stress through the environment onto your genome has a positive influence on longevity. And there are, things in that vein are things like fasting and heat shock proteins and so forth.
Yeah. So the sauna, you were in Laird's sauna,
yeah.
You go up to 250 degrees.
So
right?
Laird has a couple saunas. One goes to I want to say it's 220 or 230, and then he has another sauna in California that goes up to about 250. So he likes it hot, and the bulk of the research is on Finnish saunas. And you're in the right temperature sauna when your heart rate gets up, about 140 or so. Then you're getting that sort of cardiovascular benefit. You're releasing the heat shock proteins and so forth. But yeah, he has quite a heat tolerance just due to years and years of sauna use, basically.
Yeah.
And then sometimes he'll alternate that with cold baths and other things. So.
Yeah. And you were doing cold therapy for a long time before your second child. I remember seeing pictures of your freezer.
Yeah, we did. I did a run for 60 days where I did, we filled a deep freezer up with water, which you can do and plug it in, and the whole freezer turns into a giant ice block. But before it turns into an ice block, the top starts to crust over with ice. Basically, it's 32 degrees, then you unplug it, and then you've got your own frozen ice bath you can go in every day. Yeah. So I did that daily for 60 days straight, 3 to 4 minutes at 32 degrees first thing in the morning. And, basically I was exploring a lot of these ideas around hot cold therapy, what it did for energy, inflammation, metabolism, etc.
Yeah.
And it was also the time when I was starting this clinic, so I needed a lot of extra energy. I had a brand new baby at home, and, it just felt like a good thing to do in the context of a bunch of life stress,
It's amazing, though, how your body adapts. Like I noticed, because I've been doing it for quite a while now, and did it this morning, actually. I have an outside one. It's a 110-gallon, like horse trough kind of thing. And I'm so tolerant. Like I never thought, like I heard naturopathic doctors talk about cold immersions and cold showers like in 2010, and I thought, I tried it and I totally wimped out. But over time your body acclimates, and the same thing with the sauna. So it's really interesting how over time our body acclimates to these things, and presumably there's some cool signaling going on and everything like that. So it's a part of the equation. But anyway, it's fun stuff. But getting back to more of the longevity and the signaling, you've sent me a few papers which I think are really interesting. I have them in my backpack actually about arresting senescence or delaying senescence. And it's a big, maybe we can just kind of define what cellular senescence is, why it may not be favorable for longevity.
Yeah, so let's talk about senescence, and we'll take a quick step back, and hopefully we'll have a time to highlight these different pathways. But I think what's very interesting in the field of anti-aging is two things. One is we have a metric that we'll talk about, but that can maybe better identify our biological age. So we can tell if different interventions are translating to increased lifespan. Two, we have a plethora of pathways that not only has been researched for the last 10 or 20 years, but finally there's some very interesting studies being published, as you alluded to. And I think 2019 in many ways really highlighted some huge shifts in what was being published in human clinical trials. For the first time, we had studies in humans on being able to activate, to have drugs that have a senolytic effect in human. We had some very interesting research in humans on rapamycin. We have some emerging and evolving research on drugs like Metformin. So let's talk about senescent cells for a second. Sure. So I think this is a twofold issue. With age comes the increase in junk in your bodies, basically. And what that refers to on a cellular level is you have cells in your body that accumulate that don't really do what they're supposed to do, but they also don't self-destruct. So the accumulation of what's called senescent cells. These are cells that are not working properly. They really should die, but they don't apoptose or self-destruct. But at the same time, they're not really performing their essential functions well. So imagine if you start to accumulate all these junk cells in your body, they affect the surrounding cells. And they begin to, they're sort of like, if you're hanging out with the wrong peer group in high school, these are sort of the guys your mom says, don't hang out with those guys. So these senescent cells affect the cells around them. And what animal studies have shown for years now is that if you can just simply get rid of these senescent cells in your body, you get a 10 or 20% life extension in pretty much every animal model that's ever been studied. So people have been wondering for a long time, like, hey, can we use these drugs in humans? And some of these drugs have been known for a long time, and some of these things are supplements, actually. They're over-the-counter, cheap supplements that have a senolytic effect in humans, which means there's a target on senescent cells which can be activated by drugs or supplements that causes that cell that's not working properly to finally self-destruct and go away. What's interesting about senescent cells is they're associated with a senescent secretory phenotype. So, for example, if you have a patient with a lot of senescent cells, there's a phenotype associated with that, which means there's a lot of biomarkers, and most of these things like, TNF alpha, interleukin 6, interleukin 1 beta, C-reactive protein, etc. This is part of a secretory phenotype that gets overexpressed if you get a lot of senescent cells. And interestingly, if you get rid of your senescent cells, your phenotype improves, which means you have less inflammation. You're, have less collateral damage to surrounding healthy cells. So it is one of the sort of holy grail adages in anti-aging medicine that if you simply can have a positive effect on senescent cells, you will live longer. And certainly we've seen that in animal studies. And finally, 2019 was really a paradigm shift in a sense around this topic, because we had 2 clinical studies at Mayo showing that induction of a senolytic effect in humans was possible for the first time. And there was 2 studies. One was done in a lung disease model, and the other was done with diabetic kidney disease, which was the most recent published study in October. And just to highlight that very quickly, they used an old oncology drug that's used in leukemia. It's called dasatinib, and they mix that with a over-the-counter bioflavonoid called quercetin. And that combination, taken just for 3 days, which you could argue is very safe, caused all the senescent cells, or many of them, to go away. And the way they proved that in human subjects is they took biopsies. So you have a lot of senescent cells in your fat tissue, for example. So fat becomes a pretty convenient place to take a biopsy. To prove that your burden of senescent cells decreased, they also looked at the phenotype I described earlier. And of course, these people had less inflammatory markers. Their senescent cell burden decreased. Whether or not these people will live longer if they do this periodically, we don't know. But certainly the animal studies suggest that's possible.
Wow. Very, very fascinating. I want to drill down to mechanisms, but I didn't realize that there was like a cellular senescent secretome. And you talked about like these cells, they accumulate, so they're off-gassing, if you will, for lack of a better word, biomarkers, inflammatory cytokines, signaling molecules that have downstream consequences that affect the normal healthy cells.
Totally. It's a collateral damage from the overaccumulation of dysfunctional cells in the body. As you can imagine, if you have too many parts in your car that stop working, there's collateral effects, on, different parts of your car. So I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And again, in animal models, simply removing those cells leads to a longevity benefit. And what's fascinating about this pathway is it's arguably one of the easiest to exploit. It's easier to exploit than the sirtuin pathway, probably easier to exploit than the stem cell pathway. It might even be easier than the AMPK pathway or the mTOR pathway. And we're talking about an old, well-studied chemo drug in a relatively low dose for 3 days, mixed with 1,000 milligrams a day of quercetin, which is, comes from the pith of citrus fruit and the skin of apples. So this is interesting stuff,
I think a lot of people right now, if they're listening or watching the video, they're probably thinking about, okay, when I fast, I increase this process called autophagy. Autophagy is linked to, and I think people misconstrue what autophagy actually is on a physiologic level. It leads to degradation of cells, but we know, of course, it's an intracellular phenomenon. But does this process of autophagy then trigger cellular senescence and have a senolytic effect?
Yeah. I think there's an interrelationship between autophagy and sort of elimination of senescent cells. And a lot of studies will look at both processes. It's a little easier to study getting rid of senescent cells than it is to look at markers that correlate with autophagy. We're still early days there, and in humans it's very tough. I mean, there's upregulation of something inside the cell called the autophagosome, and to really see if that's happening in every cell of your body with exploitation involving fasting is tricky. So you look at kind of surrogate processes that are interrelated to get a sense that autophagy is happening. But let's talk about autophagy for a second. And there are many other much more intelligent people than myself that go into this in great detail. Rhonda Patrick is a good example. But basically, cells in your body, the organelles within those cells, so the ribosomes, the lysosomes, the mitochondria, we hear a lot about mitochondrial dysfunction. What if your cell could recognize that a certain organelle, in other words, an organ inside of the cell, like the mitochondria, is not working well? So you're not metabolism is not happening the way it should. Respiration on a cellular level is not occurring the way it should because the mitochondria is affected by toxins or poor diet or whatever. What if that cell could just take that malfunctioning mitochondria, and put it in a car wash, basically, and take apart all the proteins and amino acids and vitamins and nutrients that make up that organelle and reconfigure them into a pristine brand new mitochondria. That's basically what happens during autophagy. Mm-hmm. Another thing that can happen during autophagy is if a cell really is past a point of no return, it can self-senesce or basically autophage itself. So autophagy is a process when it's upregulated whereby the body does a much better job at cleaning up cells in the body, mm-hmm. or basically destroying cells that aren't functioning well, like the case of senescent cells maybe, for example. So I think exploiting autophagy is another key hallmark of any anti-aging program. We know that that's possible through various iterations of fasting, also through activating this mTOR complex, which we can talk about maybe through drugs like Rapamycin, for example. And autophagy is a holy grail because our cells get more dysfunctional with age. The organelles within our cells get more dysfunctional with age. And if we can maintain healthier DNA, healthier cell organelles, reduction in senescent cell burden, we're going to live longer. And in fact, if you exploit this pathway in animals, and there are many ways to induce autophagy. There was a Nobel Prize, I think it was 2017, Japanese research when they discovered the autophagosome and some other processes over decades and really laid out how this whole process occurs called autophagy. There's a lot of excitement in anti-aging because when you induce this, and it's always running, your cells are going through autophagy now. It's like, I think you can think of it this way. You can have no autophagy, some autophagy, or a lot of autophagy. And if there's very low autophagy activation in the body, you're going to have shortened lifespan. If you're doing a better job periodically upregulating autophagy, you're going to have life extension because of the implications here around having cells that work properly, basically, is what autophagy speaks to, and identifying more readily when a cell is not functioning well, which happens more when autophagy is upregulated. Interestingly, a lot of things people would perceive as stressors to the body have a powerful impact on upregulating autophagy. And there's a little bit of a counterintuitive aspect to this. Like, for example, fasting. Doctors would say for decades is the worst thing you can do. You have cancer, oh my God, you fast, you're going to wither away and die. If you fast for more than a week, you're going to die. I mean, there are literally doctors that would say if you fast for 3 days, you're going to die. Obviously, this is hogwash. And one of the reasons is when you fast, your body gets so good at recycling these organelles that you can go 30, 60 days without eating anything, and your body becomes a master recycler of things that aren't working properly, and it reassembles those nutrients that are already available in each cell. But that stressor has this hormetic effect, which is basically something very, very interesting from an anti-aging point of view.
Totally. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is the tissue specificity of autophagy. And like you said, I like how you talked about it's expressed or can be viewed, the paradigm under which we should look at autophagy is this U-shaped curve. Because I think a lot of people think, well, it's not enough, we want to maximize this. So people are, I think, sometimes over-fasting and overdoing it. And if you look at, for example, adipocytes, and we talked about the high presence of senescent cells in fat tissue, like there, if you biopsy overweight individuals, there's a high, like an adaptive upregulation in autophagy, right? And in different disease states, different cancers, if you look at some of the oncological medications, some of them are designed to inhibit overexpressed autophagy within the immune system because certain cancers use it as an adaptation to evade the immune system. And so I think it's kind of interesting that it's the lay people who are interested in health are all about it, but the science is like far from being conclusive about, how to measure it, what tissues do you want it upregulated or not. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, but going back to the idea that potentially autophagy is linked to increasing or getting rid of senescent cells through some mechanisms, potentially. What other, and let me just pause here, what do some of these studies, are they looking at metabolomics and proteomics to figure out some of the secretome of these bad cells? Yeah,
the way the DNA expresses itself is going to be different if autophagy is upregulated. So that's one thing that is looked at. It gets very complicated though, and it's sort of beyond my understanding exactly sort of the exact markers they're looking at. There's a FOXO marker they look at, for example. But it's so complex that really there's no commercially available test. So consequently, I think if you look at the sort of, popular media sphere around autophagy in the last 2 years when this became a very hot topic, you have basically a lot of people saying things like fasting induces autophagy, intermittent fasting induces autophagy, ketogenic diets induce autophagy, and maybe this or that drug induces autophagy. The reality is, as you mentioned very accurately, is the science is sort of not caught up with a lot of these ideas expressed by various people, around the internet. So in other words, so much to the point that, I can't even tell you today if it takes 3 days of a water fast or 6 days of a water fast to induce autophagy. Mm-hmm. Nobody really knows. You can look at surrogates, and that's what Walter Longo has done at USC, for example. One of the surrogates they look at is stem cell activation in the refeeding stage after a fasting state. Because if you've successfully induced autophagy and you've really gotten rid of a lot of junk, the next logical thing the body does during refeeding is it makes a lot of new cells because you've just gotten rid of a bunch of junk cells. And if you see a huge rise in stem cell activity in the bloodstream, you probably can assume that autophagy happened. And that's what they see with their fasting mimicking diet, and that's what you see in mouse studies. If you do a 2-day water fast in mice, you see this upregulation of stem cells. So post-interventional, huge increase uptick in stem cell activity is maybe one way to look at it. Also, there are other things they look at in those studies like IGF-1 and some other things. But it's hard to say. I think probably, and hopefully this won't come back to haunt me, but it is probably true based on the current evidence that ketogenic diets and intermittent fasting, if you do like a daily 16-hour fast, for example, probably don't have as big an effect of autophagy as a prolonged fast of some type, whether it's water or something like a fasting mimicking diet, for example. So we'll know the answer to these questions probably in the not too distant future. But I think everybody is trying to find that magic. Like people like Peter Attia might be doing a 7-day water fast, or I think his latest thing is more like a 3 or 4 day water fast once a month to assume that autophagy is going to happen. And I think that's probably reasonable, but I'll leave the listeners with this thought. In mice, it takes at least a 2-day water fast to probably induce this process. Now, mice have a much faster metabolism than humans. So if you think about this mathematically in human beings, it's probably equivalent to 4 or 5 days of a water fast to get the effect observed in mice over 2 days.
Right. No, it is interesting. I've have a lot of PubMed alerts on some of these different things. So I've looked at some of the studies, but it seems to be contingent upon your training state. So individuals who are sedentary versus active people, when they fast for 36 hours, they looked at some of the autophagosome initiation proteins, L3B. Beclin-1 was another one. There's a few of these different markers, right? And what they found is that the more physically fit or more trained you are, the faster that you induce autophagy. And it kind of makes sense. And kind of a natural segue maybe into AMPK and mTOR, because in individuals who are exercising, presumably, creating, glucose or glycogen deficits, kickstart AMPK, and that's the trigger for autophagy. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And there was another one that looked at 72 hours of fasting. They didn't differentiate the subjects based upon training state, but that led to a mere, I think it was only a 15% increase in all the autophagosome proteins. So it sounds like, yes, 72 hours of fasting, it's going to do all this, but you're like, 15%?
Right.
I could be wrong. Maybe at most it was 30%. But
what do we need? That's the bigger question is always taking a step back and saying, well, what's our goal? Okay, what's our goal with this stuff? If our goal is health and lifespan extension, maybe a periodic 15% increase in autophagy is fine. Maybe if we're trying to get a much more pronounced effect on lifespan, or maybe reversal or prevention of chronic disease, maybe there's a different thing to go after. But as you're talking about, there's a lot of theories now on synergy between activating different pathways at the same time, which would kind of make sense, because if you're a Paleolithic person and you've gone 2 months without food, there's a lot of things going on. You're freezing cold, it's wintertime, there's more physical stress on your body. You're searching for food maybe frantically. Maybe you're activating, I don't know, maybe you're activating AMPK a lot while suppressing mTOR. So maybe there's synergy, and then you're freezing. So maybe the cold is causing its own sort of hermetic stress response in the body. And I think this is a very fascinating story. If you go back a few billion years and you're a cell floating around in the ocean, you're pretty primitive. But even those primitive cells have a primitive version of insulin. So they have an AMPK thing going on. They have mTOR. mTOR is existent in every cell that's ever been studied on the planet. And what a single cell organism floating around in the ocean, 3 billion years ago on planet Earth, had in common is they could sense salt, they can sense amino acids, and they can sense heat. And in those same three, I don't know about the salt one so much, but certainly nutrient availability, heat, and
energy,
is basically fundamental to every organism on the planet. And what's so interesting about the evolving field of anti-aging medicine is all the anti-aging interventions are pushing on one of those stress pedals.
Yeah.
So with the heat shock stuff, you get that through, exercise, saunas, AMPK, you're getting activation through exercise, caloric restriction, ketogenic diets, certain supplements like berberine, drugs like Metformin, and for the mTOR pathway, which is an amino acid sensing pathway that lets a cell know there's food availability or food scarcity, you're getting, excitement in the anti-aging field around drugs like rapamycin and fasting, because suppression of mTOR leads to autophagy. Activation of mTOR leads to potentially unmitigated growth, which has negative implications for cancer, which is, sort of interrelated with, we could talk much more about AMPK. If you activate AMPK, you're getting beneficial effects because let's take a step back to the cell sensing environment 3 billion years ago. And Sinclair talks about this a lot too in his new book, but basically, here's a good way of thinking about this. If there is a lot of nutrients available in your environment, what is a cell going to do?
Grow.
It's going to grow and divide. So you're a single cell organism, you're in the ocean, there's lots of amino acids and nutrients floating around. You say, awesome, I'm going to procreate because everything is ripe in my environment to signal me to procreate. And humans have these same signals. So basically, abundance of nutrients in the environment, you're going to grow and divide and grow and divide. That's great if you're growing and dividing. It may not be good in the context of cancer, or that growth and division may shorten lifespan too in mammals and humans. Now, if there is no nutrients in the environment, what does your cell do?
Yeah, it's break down, tear down, reuse.
It gets really good at recycling, and it hunkers down. And one of the things it does when it hunkers down is it protects its DNA. Why would a cell protect their DNA when they're in a harsh environment?
So that when there is nutrients, it could procreate potentially.
Exactly. So cells are very smart apparatuses. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here after 4 billion years of evolution. So a cell says, geez, there's nuclear radiation from that comet that just landed, and there's no more protein in my environment. And God, the Earth just got really hot because of this volcano that erupted over here. What am I going to do? I'm not growing and dividing right now because I don't want my children to be subjected to this, and I don't want to have so many DNA breaks that I mutate left, right, and center. So I'm going to use all of my energy to, one, protect my DNA. I'm going to protect it so good that it can't break at all. And in fact, that's what happens when you activate sirtuin genes with NAD and stuff, which is part of David Sinclair's work. It's also going to get really good at recycling. So it's going to find organelles that aren't working and nutrients that aren't doing what they're supposed to, basically it's going to scavenge really well. And it turns out that this environmental stress response is of paramount importance if that cell or human or any living creature is interested in longevity, because exploitation of these same stressors protect DNA and clean up cellular processes through autophagy. So we're entering a new phase of anti-aging medicine. Anti-aging medicine 20 years ago was take this pile of antioxidants. The antioxidant theory of aging is gone. It's toast. It's been largely debunked. You can take all the antioxidants you want. Take athletes who take vitamin C actually has a negative effect if you look at some research. So we're in a new era here, which is, hey, we have a fundamental understanding of cellular biology and how these primal hormetic stressors either affect growth on one hand or affect self-renewal, autophagy, and lifespan extension on the other hand.
It's super fascinating to see where this whole field has gone, because when I thought of When A4M first came online, the American Association for Anti-Aging Medicine, right? It was a lot about hormones and maybe, peptides and HGH in this. And now we're kind of getting into this. We'll talk more about epigenetic age and senescence, and it's pretty fascinating. But assuming, going back to I love that analogy of just this one cell and manipulating the environment to figure out how we can then apply that to our own kind of lives. And, the situation where there's amino acid excess and energy excess, and I think a lot of people now are in that situation where they're snacking every 2 or 3 hours, they're eating around the clock, not honoring their circadian rhythm, etc. So presumably this whole mTOR pathway is being overstimulated. Is that then driving or facilitating the formation of senescent cells as well?
That is a great question. I don't know if overactivation of TOR is a direct link to accumulation of senescent cell burden.
Okay.
Great question. I don't know. But, definitely our modern lifestyle is leading to an increased senescent cell burden. And I think the most obvious example of that is the sort of cardio-metabolic epidemic that's in the United States. So, again, if you are constantly in a feeding state, and you go back to that cell analogy, you're growing and dividing like crazy. The context in the human body is you're storing and growing like crazy. Storing and growing, storing and growing. You're storing excess glycogen as fat tissue. You're growing bigger. You're stimulating things like cancer growth through upregulation of IGF-1, which is a growth hormone related compound, and also insulin, both of which drive growth. So what you see in the United States is you see a phenomenon of people literally getting bigger and bigger every year and getting a higher incidence of cardiometabolic diseases like cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, etc. And these are largely mitigated when we start to restrict the availability of nutrients, because the body shifts then from a storage state, which causes cardiometabolic diseases, to a utilize the storage state. And I think you see this most clearly with the AMPK pathway. So if you activate AMPK through fasting and exercise, you signal the body to burn more fats, burn up your cholesterol particles for energy, you increase fatty acid oxidation, you get any sugar and glycogen you've stored now turns into energy. If on the other hand, you keep feeding your body, glucose and excess protein and stuff, your body gets an opposite signal. So now you're ramping down that pathway, you're getting storage, you're storing lipids, you're getting fatty liver disease, you're getting a fatty pancreas, you're getting insulin resistance, you're getting prediabetes, diabetes. You're clogging up the system with too many cells producing too much junk. And, this is the problem of our time right now. We are basically in an epidemic of overfeeding. And the solution is quite elegant, it's simple, it's cheap, it's economical, it's unpopular. But it's getting more popular because people are seeing how easy it is to simply do things like restrict your feeding window, for example. But you can, we'll talk about synergy today. There's synergy between doing things like intermittent fasting, maybe with things that have a direct activity on AMPK, and then suppressing TOR through managing our protein intake and our glucose intake as well.
Brilliant. As a clinician, my next question was going to be, how can you sort of triangulate if you have a patient you're sitting knee to knee with to figure out which direction these pathways are being pushed and pulled? Is there enough AMPK stimulation, enough compensatory mTOR inhibition, et cetera, to optimize longevity? And so do you kind of look at liver enzymes, triglycerides, kind of classical metabolic syndrome biomarkers to give you an insight? Because it's not like you can look into someone's cells. Hopefully one day we can, and we can look at epigenetic age and so on, which we'll talk about in a minute. But is that how you assess this balance?
Yeah, I think from a clinical standpoint, you're interested in where people are on this trajectory. The average person is going to go down based on some kind of cardiometabolic disease-related phenomenon. So clinically, you're trying to see where are they on that path. So you can do very simple things like looking at liver enzymes. You start to see those go up along with triglycerides. You have a hunch that they have fatty liver disease, which is the beginning of insulin resistance and diabetes. So you're definitely keyed into that. You're looking at inflammatory markers, again, speaking to the senescent-associated secretory phenotype, or really any other negative phenotype that's related to chronic inflammation. So C-reactive protein is a very common test we may do. We may put people on the body fat machine to see how much visceral fat they have. So if you're, hyperaccumulating visceral and adipose fat tissue in your body, again, you're in this place which is very common now in the United States, where you're just accumulating too much storage because you're overfeeding or your feeding window is too long. So we're looking at that. We're also looking at things like insulin and C-peptide. We're looking at hemoglobin A1C to see if people are more obviously pre-diabetic, which is very easy to diagnose. So I think, in cholesterol, we do some NMR profiles. We look at things like VLDL and stuff to get a sense of what's happening with lipid transport and so forth. But a lot of this stuff's pretty simple. I mean, you can jump on a scale and kind of get a sense of what's going on. You can dive a little deeper with some classic cardio-metabolic markers, which are, 15 years ago, I think it seemed exotic to maybe talk about C-reactive protein and oxidized LDL and VLDL and so forth. But now these are very, very common, low drag tests to run. Hormone-wise, you can look at some things too that get a little more exotic, things like adiponectin, for example. You can see what's happening with, cortisol, DHEA, testosterone levels and stuff. But I think the meat is really in things like expanded cholesterol profiles, liver function tests, insulin, hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month average of your blood glucose levels themselves, and so forth.
What about IGF and IGF binding protein? I know you have a little marker that you talked about before when we've done other interviews. Do you look at that often, or?
We do IGF-1. I think I'm doing it more now because I'm interested in IGF-1 as another surrogate marker to get a sense of what's happening with TOR. I mean, to make it simple, there are basically 2 or 3 things that activate TOR. Again, if you activate TOR, which is the mammalian or mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is largely this thing discovered by David Sinclair, is over at MIT, with this bacteria found in Rapa Nui. We can talk a lot about, but basically look up mTOR online, and you'll learn a lot about this stuff.
Super fascinating. So IGF-1 can kind of triangulate and give you
thanks for coming back to this. So IGF-1, to make a long story short, if you overconsume protein, the average American gets 20 to 30% of their caloric intake as protein. Blue zones cultures get about 10%. You get too far north of 20, 30% protein in your diet, you're going to get increased IGF-1 because what protein does is it increases growth hormone in the body. And certain types of protein, these are specific amino acids that do this, probably methionine and leucine primarily, but they increase IGF-1. IGF-1 is a growth signaling hormone, which is related to growth hormone and somewhat related to insulin as well. And there's a sweet spot for growth hormone. You need growth hormone to build muscle, right? But you get too much growth hormone, you may have a problem in the context of longevity or cancer. So too little growth hormone and you have problems. If you're a 60 or 70 or 80-year-old, you actually want a little more growth hormone than a 30-year-old, or maybe I shouldn't say more, but you want a reasonably good level of growth hormone, or you could get bone loss and sarcopenia, which is muscle wasting. So a lot of this tracking of IGF-1 is sort of an age-dependent thing, but by and large, again, it's another one of these curves. It's like too little IGF-1, you've got muscle wasting, bone loss, and all the problems associated with low growth hormone, your short stature, all the other things. Too much, maybe you have cancer and short lifespan. So where we get to this sort of middle point with IGF-1 in the research is largely by looking at epidemiologic evidence, which looks at cultures that have a long lifespan and looks at their IGF-1 levels. And by and large, if you go to Sardinia, if you go to Greece, if you go to parts of Italy, if you go to Loma Linda, California, Okinawa, Japan, etc., they look at their IGF-1 levels. And, what might your guess be as to what is, a lot of, say, bodybuilders would love their IGF-1 level to be, let's just say 300, right? Longo has kind of a target for IGF-1, but it's sort of evolving, but he has a strong sense of probably where it should be in midlife if you want a longevity benefit. And again, we could get into the complexity of this because it may be high or low in different seasons or depending on how you're fasting or eating food. So again, it's going to fluctuate, but if you were thinking in terms of an average level of IGF-1 for longevity, a level where it might help induce autophagy but not be so much where you get this cancer and tumor genesis effect, we think that number is around 140 probably.
Okay. Fasting?
Good question.
Yeah.
IGF-1 is best captured first thing in the morning fasting. You have the biggest pulse of IGF-1 usually around 3 or 4 a.m. during deep wave sleep. I've always checked it fasting, but maybe I don't have the full story there. But I think it's best on fasting.
Yeah.
That's when we check it. And if it's periodically, or let's just say if it's consistently north of 200, 250, and you're say 30, 40, 50-year-old, you might want to look at your protein intake. If it's if it's pretty far north of 20%, and it's primarily protein that's high in the amino acids that have specific affinity for TOR, which we could talk about, you might have a problem in terms of longevity. Now, you can look at other things to see if that, we'll talk about the DNAge test, because there are a lot of ways to see how you're doing in terms of aging. But I think, 150 or so as a midlife IGF-1 range, if your primary interest is longevity, it is probably a reasonable number to chase.
So fascinating. I mean, grappling with this performance versus longevity. I mean, how do you personally do this, right? Because you're into yoga, you have a business, you're a father. Like, I don't know, if I fast too much and crank down the protein too much, I feel weak. I'm not recovering. I feel like, man, I'm definitely getting older because I'm not as strong as I used to be. But like, it's got to be a U-shaped curve at some level. And so David Sabatini recently put out a paper, and he was saying that, for mTOR to be stimulated, you need both the growth factors and the nutrients. And it was kind of an interesting thing for me to kind of think about, because and more pulse feeding, right? So it's like, okay, if you're going to have a steak or protein or whatever, okay, have it, but don't have the protein shake 2 hours later. That was kind of what I got from that paper. And of course, these are animal model studies. Is that kind of how you look at this?
Consistent activation of these pathways. Let's say TOR, for example. Consistent day in and day out expression of this pathway through consuming too much glucose or protein is problematic. Yeah. So we're not worried too much about I had a big steak for dinner last night. In the same way, I mean, if you look at the studies on restricted feeding windows, the mice ate the same number of calories over a 2-hour window as the other mice ate over 24 hours, but there was a dramatic difference, although their macronutrient intake was identical. So a lot of it has to do with the context in which you interface with things that provoke a rise in insulin and protein. So I think there's a lot of evolving thinking around, the implications, pulsing these things. And again, if you're a very, very active person, the standard rules may not apply. I mean, if you're very catabolic, let's say you're an ultra runner or you're lifting weights 3 hours a day, what applies to you may be different than what applies to the masses who are much more sedentary. So I think it adds complexity to this topic, but certainly your requirement for growth hormone is going to increase if you're engaged in very catabolic activity. So common sense would say, okay, you probably need a little bit more protein. You need a little bit more activation of IGF-1 if you're catabolizing tissue at that rate. So it could be that how you chase IGF-1 from a longevity point of view depends on more individual characteristics like your activity level, but I think what we have to go on now is largely the animal studies where they control IGF-1 levels, they control amino acid intake like methionine. If you restrict methionine in mice, they live longer. And that's they actually use that in a lot of mouse extension models. They simply take methionine out of their diet. And methionine is one of the main activators of TOR. So it is true, IGF-1, certain amino acids, and insulin. These are all the factors that affect TOR, and we talk about TOR a lot in this topic. It's really something that if people are interested in, it's when I started to explore it, I just kind of opened Pandora's box. But the last 2 decades of research on TOR are fascinating. I mean, what you can do to extend longevity by suppressing TOR and therefore inducing autophagy is phenomenally interesting. And what's horrifying is that if you look at the American diet, it's doing the exact opposite. What is the average American doing? Again, World Health Organization says 10% protein is fine. If you look at the longevity blue zones, 10% protein is what they eat. We're at a 30% protein, very high animal, which is high in methionine, amino acid diet, at the same time when we're eating a lot of refined carbohydrates and not exercising.
Right.
So let's put that in the TOR context, in the longevity context. I mean, not only are we on the roadmap towards diabetes and cancer and Alzheimer's disease, we're shortening our lifespans way beyond, and it's so obvious the reason. It's now very well elucidated with the science, thanks to people like Longo and Sabatini, who I had the pleasure of hearing lecture at USC a year and a half ago. Yeah. It's very, very interesting time to be paying attention to this stuff. And I think like a lot of these topics, they're hot topics. You're going to hear a lot of discourse and debate, and somebody has their program and their protocol and this and that, but the fundamentals are this. If you overconsume foods that provoke a rise too much in insulin or IGF-1 chronically, you're going to have problems.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, a lot of bodybuilders and fitness people, this is what they're doing, right? I mean, they're eating every 2 or 3 hours. I used to be like that, and that's why I fast, because I had a protein shake probably, 2 or 3 times a day for years of my life, in addition to all these meals. And one day I was like 32 and I looked in the mirror, I'm like, I look older than I should, and so that inspired me to make a lot of sweeping lifestyle changes. But yeah, it's very fascinating. So along those lines, I definitely want to get into finish up the senescence conversation, but since we're right here talking about mTOR and AMPK, if I could write drugs for myself, I would take like Rapamycin, 2 milligrams twice a week. Mm-hmm. Maybe do 500 milligrams of Metformin on days that I don't work out. Uh-huh. What do you personally do? Where do you think this is going? Because it's like we were talking offline, it's going to be years before we have these human studies, and people want to do stuff now.
Yeah. So let's talk about 3 or 4 things. One, somebody could do now, and a lot of anti-aging enthusiasts are getting doctors to prescribe these things. So, caveat is I'm not, necessarily recommending these things, but talk to your doctor about these things, because some of them, again, the human research is there's a paucity of human research still, but activating this senolytic pathway is very interesting. That can be done by taking, dasatinib and quercetin, and there's 2 human studies from 2019 that lay out 2 protocols which are fairly similar. One is an over-the-counter supplement, 1,000 milligrams of quercetin, mixed with an old leukemia drug called dasatinib, which was 100 milligrams a day for 3 days. That might be done twice a year if somebody wants to decrease their senescent cell burden, if they have a senescent cell burden, which, again, let's go to the next step. So AMPK, how do we activate the AMPK pathway so that we utilize stored stuff instead of store stuff, basically, to put it simply? There are a few ways. Metformin is one way, and there's a funding that's recently been had by a researcher to try to look at, his name's Neil, I forget his last name, you probably would know his last name, but he's secured $40 or $50 million in funding to run an anti-aging study on metformin. Metformin, through activation of AMPK, probably has a relevant effect in terms of anti-aging for the average American who is wrestling with cardio-metabolic disease. If you or I take metformin, I don't know. I think there may be less of a benefit in the context of, not being overweight, not having high insulin, and so forth. But if you meet the sort of classic cardiometabolic disease profile, probably there's an anti-aging benefit to taking a drug like metformin, because you're activating AMPK and you're having a lot of benefits. Whether you or I take metformin, if you or I have a longevity benefit, we don't know yet. So I personally don't take metformin, but I'm interested in activating AMPK through other ways. So you can do that through berberine, you can do that through metformin, 500 milligrams to 2,000 milligrams a day, which is a prescription drug, which is very well studied for 6 decades now. It comes from a plant, actually, in Europe, which herbal lore showed that it lowered sugar, and they turned it into the drug Autophagy, which became metformin. Very interesting history on metformin. You can do that through a Chinese herb called jiaogulan, which is kind of newer to the scene, but Life Extension has an AMPK activator supplement that has jiaogulan in it, which the subculture in China that uses a lot of jiaogulan tea has always said that it has a sort of a longevity tonic, but now we know it's an AMPK activator. So berberine, jiaogulan, metformin are ways to activate that pathway. We talked about exploiting the senescent cell pathway. So rapamycin, a lot of anti-aging doctors are taking rapamycin now. I think the problem with rapamycin is we know that suppressing TOR through using rapamycin works out pretty well in animal models. In humans, we have no idea what the dose is. So we literally do not know. If you take too much, you suppress the immune system. So everybody's terrified to take rapamycin because of that. If you take too little, it's not going to do anything. So what is the sweet spot? And it's been proposed, as you mentioned, a couple milligrams twice a week or 5 milligrams a week, which is a popular protocol right now, is certainly what people are doing. We won't know till we get some of these aging test data back on some of these people that are doing this. I personally am not taking rapamycin at the moment, but there are some other versions of rapamycin which might be helpful for the skin, for example. This is a compounded version of rapamycin, which is a skin cream. A very recent study done within the last few months showed that topical rapamycin reduced fine lines and wrinkles and age spots, and increased collagen in subjects who were, I believe, in their 60s. So very, very interesting research. And, topical rapamycin was like 1/100th of the oral dose. So this has got to be one of the safest ways you can exploit an anti-aging pathway in your skin. See if your doctor would prescribe that for you. I think it's a fairly safe idea. But oral rapamycin, I'm hugely interested in. But again, if you're already doing intermittent fasting, if you're doing periodic fasting, if you're doing fasting mimicking, if you're a healthy body weight, how much more benefit do you get from taking rapamycin in that context? I think what we really need is to know what's happening with autophagy, to know what's happening with our DNA methylation, to really know do we need 50 interventions to promote lifespan and health span? Is there a universal idea that's good for everybody? And maybe rapamycin at a low dose satisfies that equation. Like, okay, well, we know this pathway is the primary anti-aging pathway because of what it does to autophagy. We know autophagy is a holy grail of anti-aging. Therefore, everybody should, we should put rapamycin in the groundwater. I mean, there are some people who talk like that, but there are downsides. All the drugs I've mentioned so far can have side effects, so I think it's important to mention the chemo drug I mentioned earlier can definitely have side effects. You can get, pancytopenia, neutropenia, and so forth. You can get nausea, vomiting. Rapamycin can cause aphthous ulcers. It can cause immunosuppression in high doses. Quercetin doesn't really have any side effects to my knowledge. Metformin, its main side effect is diarrhea. It can also cause a B12 and magnesium deficiency. So everything is a risk benefit, right? So what you want to do as a person interested in anti-aging is to establish sort of where you are on the aging trajectory. Are you aging well? Are you aging really quickly? And then discover which interventions are out there currently that will move the needle the furthest for you with the least potential for side effects. And if we take a step back, for the average person in this country, it's probably fasting or some iteration or derivation of fasting is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck with the least side effects, and you're going to be powerfully activating all the pathways that Mike and I are talking about today. I mean, you're going to be positively affecting AMPK. You increase NAD. We didn't talk about NAD much, which we can talk about briefly, but basically NAD is sort of the rocket fuel that sirtuins need to do their job to both protect DNA, but also to have the caloric restriction mimetic effect. And you can ramp up NAD through fasting. It declines with the aging process. Certain diets and foods may increase NAD, like keto diets. You could probably speak more to this than me, but anyway, diet can push the pedal on NAD. But again, fasting increases NAD, increases sirtuin activity, increases AMPK, suppresses mTOR, reduces senolytic cell burden, reduces adipose and visceral fat tissue, lowers your risk of cancer. We know people who periodically fast have less cancer and less heart disease. There's a brand new study published the last couple of weeks showing decreased cardiovascular disease amongst people who periodically fast. And so much so now that the American College of Cardiology, I believe, is now endorsing fasting because the sort of retrospective analysis on people who do this periodically is so good from a cardiovascular standpoint. Why wouldn't you recommend? I mean, fasting should be like number one thing we talk about,
right?
Because again, it's safe and it hits all of these anti-aging pathways. So
it's amazing. Yeah, that meta-analysis just was published recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to ignore meta-analysis, as you and your viewers probably know. I mean, you have layers of evidence in medicine. Single case study, sort of interesting. Animal studies, interesting. Human studies, interesting. Meta-analyses, which is a study of studies. Now you get into some very objective evidence for whatever theory you're trying to propose.
Super fascinating. I think the only kind of challenge or drawback there is if they include, and I haven't looked at this, some of the alternate day fasting studies, the materials and methods are a little bit different. Some studies are 0-calorie alternate day fasting. Some studies allow for up to 260 kilojoules, which is roughly 500 calories. So it's like anyway, it gets a little murky, but this, I think the data was pretty good. But you mentioned NAD, and some people, I get asked this question all the time. Mike, do you take NAD? What about NMN, NR? Like, what's going on with that? And then maybe that kind of ties in about sirtuins and epigenetics, and we can kind of circle back there.
Yeah, so NAD has a lot of related metabolites. And NAD or its metabolites are hugely interesting in the context of both performance and anti-aging medicine, because NAD turns out to be basically a limiting factor for a lot of processes involved with both performance and longevity. So there's like an NAD-NADH ratio, which is well studied. There's the effect of NAD on sirtuins, which are these sort of anti-aging genes that get switched on with caloric restriction. That was discovered by Sinclair and his mentor over at Harvard. The molecule resveratrol was shown to be kind of a caloric restriction mimetic, and now we're 20 years forward into that research, and it turns out that there's a sirtuin-NAD relationship. There's also a sirtuin-TOR relationship. So again, a lot of these things are interrelated, but yes, I get asked this question a lot, and going back 2 years, this is, and I'm not endorsing any of these brands, nor do I have any financial relationship with any of these companies, but Elysium is the company that makes this product called Basis, which has pterostilbene in it, which is a resveratrol-like compound that may or may not have better bioavailability, mixed with nicotinamide riboside, which is a NAD derivative that is one of these unique compounds that was actually shown in a human clinical trial to increase mitochondrial NAD. And we know in mouse studies, if you can crank up NAD, you have some positive effects in terms of metabolism and anti-aging. So the company has a lot of hype behind it, but basically, their position is if you increase NAD, you're going to get a beneficial effect, and nicotinamide riboside orally is somewhat bioavailability, and it has human data at least showing that it increased mitochondrial NAD. So if you're going to take NAD, you want to ask yourself the question is this stuff getting into my mitochondria? I think that's sort of fundamental, and if a company can sort of prove to you that it is, great. Now Sinclair, David Sinclair is working more with, he has a few things going on, but he's working with nicotinamide mononucleotide, which is very similar to nicotinamide riboside. It's another orally bioavailable agent. It's a different molecular size, but also probably increases mitochondrial NAD. But they're also trying to patent even more novel NAD derivatives. He's involved, I think, with some sort of biopharma companies, and they're basically looking at all the different compounds, trying to find. This is my understanding, is really everybody's trying to find a hyper bioavailability, NAD compound that, works well so they can subject it to some kind of human interventional trial. I will note this, what you want from any supplement is, research subjects took this supplement and there was a beneficial health effect. We don't actually know that with NAD at all. We don't know if taking it increases lifespan, for example. We don't know if taking it lowers cardio-metabolic risk. We have one study where a 1,500 milligram a day dose did nothing for glucose and lipids. So I could say, if somebody asked me about NAD, I can say, well, a high dose didn't seem to affect certain cardio-metabolic markers at all, despite the fact that the mitochondrial level is going up. So I think we have a lot of questions in regards to NAD. Now, there are other ways to take NAD. NAD patches are becoming popular. Intravenous NAD, which is done at this clinic here, which is IV drip, 4 hours or so of intravenous NAD. NAD is also available through subcutaneous injection. A lot of researchers will say that may or may not work. I think it's early days with NAD, NAD dose, NAD derivatives, NMN versus NR. That's a mouthful. Try to say that 10 times fast. So, but a lot of people feel like, well, it's probably safe. It's, relatively easy to take these things. I'm going to take them because, the research on what happens when you increase NAD is so strong. Yeah. But we're much farther along with things actually like rapamycin and metformin and even berberine and stuff like that than we are with NAD, if you think about it, because there's been tons of human studies on metformin, and it's cancerous. Even baby aspirin has a bazillion more studies on it than things like NR, nicotinamide riboside, NAD and stuff. So we're very excited about NAD and sirtuins and stuff, but you got to take a step back and say, okay, well, what does the human clinical trial research show on these supplements? And then you realize, okay, there's 2 studies. Yeah,
and they're not very promising. I remember looking at one, I can't remember, it was recently published, but it looked at intracellular NAD levels and actually went down with supplements. And so it's anyway. So I'm not trying to poo-poo it or belittle it. People love supplements. Yeah. But you have a patch on right now, right?
I've got an NAD patch on right now, which is, there's a couple brands. There's patches called iontophoresis patches, and they deliver certain drugs through a cation gradient, and there's a battery-powered aspect to this patch, and it a little bit more efficiently delivers certain drugs over the skin. And basically, we don't know yet, but there may be opportunities for different drugs to be delivered this way. And a lot of people are toying around with NAD transdermal delivery, again, because of the effects. Now, anecdotally, we've heard from people that their energy is incredibly high if they wear these patches. We have no scientific evidence to back that up at the moment. But, we could say the same thing with IV. There's not a lot of human research, but the people that get intravenous NAD, by and large, notice what you would think would be noticed if you ramped up NAD. Primarily we're talking about energy. NAD is a sort of a rate-limiting enzyme for oxidative phosphorylation. This is the process by which your mitochondria make ATP, which means NAD equals energy, essentially. So if you ramped it up, you should have more energy. But yeah, I am wearing a patch right now. It's probably worn off. It's a 2.5 hour patch. We're looking into things like delivering maybe B vitamins or magnesium or NAD that way. But ultimately, that may or may not pan out. There's a lot of interesting, really it's an exciting time in anti-aging medicine and even drug delivery.
Yeah.
And there is so much interest in the realm of small molecules and how to get things more bioavailable. Let's talk about these DNAge kits real
Fascinating.
quick.
Yeah, I would like to, and then maybe, we could weave that back into NAD, because I think the sirtuin enzymes are NAD dependent, right? So
Totally.
We talked about that yeast, and we talked about ionizing radiation, or not yeast, that single cell back a billion years ago, et cetera. There's a lot of environmental damage, so it's trying to protect its DNA. Sirtuins mediate that, and so maybe we can indirectly ascertain what's going on a cellular level, NAD level, et cetera, by looking at the epigenetic noise and methylation patterns. Is that kind of the...
Yep. Yeah, so we'll try to kind of crack this, which is a very sort of complex topic, and it gets into a lot of, genetics and, fancy terminology and stuff. But let's look at it this way. As you age, your DNA becomes more fragile, and the fragility of DNA is, attenuated by a variety of things in your environment. So if you get a CT scan every day your whole life, you're going to have a lot of DNA damage. If you live near Chernobyl, same thing. A little bit of, ionic radiation stress has been found to be protective. Again, that gets to a hormetic effect. If you give mice a little bit of radiation, they live longer.
Wow, I didn't know.
Have you seen that research?
No.
It's hormesis. So this is hormesis in action. The right amount, the bell-shaped curve amount of the right amount of stress has a positive effect often in longevity. So basically your DNA becomes susceptible to breakage, one, and two, it also gets methylated. Now methylated DNA means that if segments of your DNA get methylated, it's like putting chewing gum in a keyhole. So you can't open the door anymore. So let's say, I use a computer analogy here. So let's say, your computer is running Microsoft, OS 10 point whatever, and you're opening your Google Chrome, and you've got your Mac Mail open and a million other apps, and they all work just fine, right? You could say your computer is in an optimal state of functioning because all the programming is doing what it was programmed to do. Now let's say with age, your computer gets so bogged up, we'll use the senescent cell example, with too much storage, okay? So now your computer is too full of storage, so you notice it's running slow. Maybe your Google Chrome isn't loading the Flash media thing as quickly or whatever. So it's kind of like the same thing happens with DNA. With age, the program that's there, certain sections of that program, of that code, get turned off. And when they get turned off, they no longer do what they're supposed to do. So maybe your liver cell no longer makes a certain enzyme, or your brain cell no longer does something it used to do, so you have cognitive impairment, or your testicles no longer make enough testosterone because a segment of DNA has become clogged up or methylated. Now methylation is a natural occurrence of the aging process. So your DNA methylates with age, and if it methylates enough, you basically are dead, because now the program can't run at all, and then you get death. So you can look at DNA methylation as a surrogate for the aging process, and in fact this work is largely done by a guy named Steve Horvath and one of his postdoc students, who's a woman named Morgan Levine, who's now at Yale, and Horvath is at UCLA. And what they've done is they've identified sections of the DNA double helix that are highly correlated with the aging process if they're methylated, and those are called CPGs. And there are thousands of CPG sites, and they've done work now on thousands of different species, and with a very high degree of accuracy, they can determine, let's say you encounter roadkill on the road at night, you could literally take some DNA from that animal, and Horvath could tell you the age of that animal within 99% accuracy.
Wow.
So this is fascinating stuff. And we talked about telomeres in our last episode together. which I'm still fascinated by telomere attrition in aging and as telomere length as a surrogate for the aging process. But DNA methylation is probably a better marker for encapsulating how we're aging, because these CPG sites are so accurate as they relate to aging. Now, some things hypermethylate your DNA. So smoking is a great example. And once you've methylated your DNA, you're pretty much screwed, like your ability for the DNA to express at that CPG site is irrevocably turned off.
So it's not plastic. This is
to my knowledge, it's not really plastic, and that's why cigarette smoking, as an example, is so disastrous to health. Once that methylation damage has been done, all you can hope to do. So you got to, increased accelerated aging and methylation, and now all you can hope to do is kind of level out that decline curve, or that accelerated methylation curve. There's something called, I think it's, pardon me if I butcher this, it might be something called the Yamaguchi factors. I think this is something Sinclair talks about. There's some fancy genetic engineering footwork that may be able to unmethylate DNA. We may discover other things. But for now, by and large, one of the goals of anti-aging medicine, I think, is to reduce the rate of DNA methylation. And it's not global methylation of DNA, but it's methylation that, because some methylation may be positive or negative, it's really these particular sites that correlate with aging that you do not want to hypermethylate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I remember Horvath's. I didn't know Levine was.
She was a postdoc with him at UCLA, and then she branched off, and they still co-author on a lot of papers, but in many ways they have sort of a divergent views, but they seem to still be collaborating.
It's interesting. Yeah, they I think there's a Horvath clock, the Levine clock, and some other, I can't remember, another Asian scientist of some sorts. But anyway, the proof of concept paper, and I think they looked at 13,000 human subjects, and they looked at different disease states. Parkinson's, Down syndrome is characteristically, there's different epigenetic patterns. So there's a lot of data here to draw back off using mathematical models, which I think is pretty fascinating. So that's amazing that you're going back to the roadkill, like that he could figure out with a blood sample or tissue sample the age of that. I know that you're waiting to submit yours. I submitted mine early December.
Again, there's no involvement with these companies, but these are two commercially available kits. One is also by the Elysium company that makes the NR product called Basis. This product is called Insight. This is largely based on the Horvath clock, whereas the myDNAge, which is myDNAge.com, they are largely using a Levine algorithm, so they consulted with Morgan Levine on their computation. But both tests take either a urine or blood sample. I think this is blood, this is urine or blood. And they look at how many of these CPGs are methylated. And based on the database of people they have, plus their algorithm, and Levine's algorithm is tuned by a few things. So some people get a little more excited about hers because she's also looking at, there's a large database of blood in the United States that has tens of thousands of people, and she's looking at that historically and correlating methylation with real age in these people over a couple decades as a way to fine-tune her algorithm. She also has something called a phenotypic age calculator, which is 9 biomarkers that can pretty accurately predict your phenotypic age, and she uses that as part of her algorithm. So it gets complicated, but these guys are, biostatisticians. Horvath, I think, is a PhD in mathematics. So this is a very sort of geeky math, but long story short is, there are brand new, within the last year, and some of these things within, this is just, I think 3 weeks old or something, ways to look at your epigenome. And these are referred to as DNA epigenetic methylation clocks. And, the turnaround on some of these tests are maybe 4 to 8 weeks. As Mike mentioned, he just did his. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do this company, and check my telomeres the same day. And I'll report back on how old I am from a variety of metrics here. But I think so let's get excited about the future of anti-aging medicine. Okay, we have some well-established pathways which we can exploit with things like fasting, drugs, and supplements. But we also now have the ability to see if it's having an impact on DNA methylation. So, if somebody can show that an intervention is slowing down DNA methylation, you've got something to pay attention to. And the most obvious thing that ties into that is a study published at UCLA, and Horvath was a co-author on this, along with some very smart guys at UCLA, and they gave study participants 3 compounds, and they checked their DNA clock at different points, baseline, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And the intervention was 12 months. They also checked their clocks 18 months later. And they gave 9 men who were in their 50s 3 compounds. And 6 months after the study ended, they had basically reversed their age process by 2.5 years based on this DNA test. So that was one of the first interventional human trials where they used epigenetic DNA clocks as a way to prove that an intervention reversed the aging process, which is hugely fascinating because you can't follow people for 100 years and see how they did. That will take forever. So we need another way to do that. And we can talk about this another time, but most of your listeners will probably be aware of this, but the intervention was human growth hormone, DHEA. There was a little bit of zinc and vitamin D, I think, used in the study. But the third major thing was metformin. Mm-hmm. And the combination of these things blew the researchers' minds. They were not expecting to see that type of DNA clock reversal. So we're entering a new age. I think that's what I'm trying to convey today, is that we're entering an age where the last 10 or 20 years of research is now being borne out in human clinical studies. We have a very clear understanding of cellular biology, how it relates evolutionarily to longevity processes. It turns out we don't have genes that control aging so much as we have genes that control longevity, which was counterintuitive and nobody thought would be the case 20 years ago. And now we have tests that you can run on yourself. So, again, I said this to Mike a year and a half ago with telomeres. Okay, you're into some supplement or some diet or you'd like to do, 10-minute handstands every day. Cool. Let's see if it actually is reversing established markers of aging, whether it be telomeres, DNA, methylation clocks, secretory senolytic phenotypes, inflammatory markers, cardio-metabolic markers, whatever. Let's do it.
I think it's amazing. I think this is why the ketogenic diet is so popular, because for the first time people could test their response metabolically, right? Glucometers have been around forever, but maybe that didn't really get too many people excited unless they've been told they have diabetes or prediabetes. But these interventions or these objective biomarkers are pretty cool. Sleep, HRV, deep sleep scores, Oura ring, all that. Now we have more, kind of epigenetic genomic biomarkers, which I think is really exciting. But going back to the study, that was, I think, September of 2019.
Yeah, super recent.
If you were to ask someone who watched all this, we talked about inhibiting growth and enhancing longevity, the idea that giving a growth factor, growth hormone, affected longevity in a favorable manner per epigenetic age is fascinating.
It's fascinating, and it's something the community is grappling with. How, on one hand, it seems so well proven that reducing IGF-1 and suppressing mTOR leads to very extended lifespans in animals and probably humans who adopt diets that do that naturally, whereas we have this 12-month interventional study with relatively high doses of human growth hormone showing this massive reversal of DNA methylation. I have one thought on that topic. I don't think we know fully, but one of the things they were mainly looking at is immunosenescence in this study. So what they were after with using things like DHEA and growth hormone was reversing immunosenescence. So immune system decline and getting your immune system to stay robust with age is another sort of holy grail of anti-aging movement, keeping your immune system strong. And one of the ways to do that is to sort of regenerate the thymus gland, which largely goes dormant in your 20s. If you can reactivate the thymic gland, you get improvement in immune systems. Now again, these tests largely are looking at the DNA methylation patterns on white blood cells because that's what's available in a blood sample. So part of me wonders if we're seeing a improvement in the health and quality of immune cells because we're using a drug cocktail that reverse engineers immunosenescence.
That's fascinating.
I don't know. But I would love to talk to people smarter than myself and see how they think about that. But yeah, it does seem paradoxical on one hand that you have studies showing increase in growth hormone leads to longevity benefit, and on the other hand, we know that high growth hormone is a disaster from a longevity standpoint. Take one example, which is the Lerone people in Peru. Mm-hmm. They have a gene mutation on sort of their ability to make IGF-1, so they're pygmies, and they're 4 foot something, and they don't eat particularly well, and they smoke cigarettes, but they never get any diseases. They don't get cancer or heart disease, and it's because their IGF-1 is always 0 basically. Wow. So there's a real world model of sort of a gene mutation in humans that leads to extraordinary health span in a population that's not otherwise that healthy, simply because of the single variable of having a suppressed IGF-1.
It's crazy. I mean, it's multifactorial, right, too, because what if there's a lot of intergenerations living together. I mean, there's a lot of different things. So yeah, it seems that IGF-1 growth hormone model, there's more speculation, I feel like, emerging at least, especially since this Horvath study. But since reading that paper, I was like, wow, maybe should I take thymic? So there's
thymosin beta, thymosin alpha, those things.
Well, in the glandulars.
Yeah.
I was trying to think, well, okay, like what else could I do? I know Biotics Research, a few companies make these glandulars you can take. Because, I'm not going to get a doctor to write growth hormone for me. They probably wouldn't. I know there's a lot of legislation. There's a lot of strict rules about growth hormones.
Yeah, there's, just briefly on that topic, physicians by and large are stymied as it relates to being able to prescribe growth hormone. It's one of the few drugs you have to prescribe on label, which means there's only really 4 clinical indications that you can use it, and proving those indications exist is largely best done by an endocrinologist. So it's
hard to get.
Cumbersome territory, let's say.
Well, there's a lot of black market stuff, but who knows what you're getting.
Right.
I mean, anyway, so glandulars, you think that would be useful?
I think if somebody wants to increase IGF-1, to try to best mimic what was in that study, probably growth hormone releasing hormones are going to be a territory that's easier for their functional or anti-aging medicine doctor to navigate, and those are drugs like tesamorelin is probably the strongest, followed maybe by things like ipamorelin, abutamorin, and sermorelin, CJC as well, mixed maybe with ipamorelin. So anyway,
these are peptides?
Yeah, these are peptides. So you want more information on that, you could contact TaylorMade Compounding. They do a lot of that stuff and can hook you up with physicians that do that. But basically, we don't know. Also, there's been some thought that, these 9 people in this study are kind of anti-aging enthusiasts already. They're kind of friends with the researchers that conducted the study. Who knows what other things they're doing? A study with 9 people in it is not enough to say run wild with this concept, start taking DHEA, growth hormone, and metformin. If anything, like most good studies, it raises more questions. And I think that's a cautionary. I don't want to curb anybody's enthusiasm, because I was certainly very excited when I saw that study. But let's take a step back. It's 9 people.
Yeah.
Who knows what else they were doing? And maybe it was the oral DHEA that did everything. We don't know. So they're planning on doing this, but it will take time. They're going to try to tease out, was it synergy, or did one of those 3 compounds exert more of an influence on these genetic clocks than another? Was it all the growth hormone, all the DHEA, or metformin? And I think we have a lot to learn with that, and we need to look at more run-of-the-mill people with larger, we need an N of 50 or 100 or 1,000. But preliminarily, man, that's pretty interesting stuff. And it wasn't just they looked at a lot of things in that study, thymic function. They also looked at inflammatory markers. They looked at lipids and stuff like that. They looked at these DNA clocks. So it was a fairly robust study in terms of what they analyzed in these subjects. But the fact is, it's 9 people who were probably relatively healthy to begin with.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've been taking DHEA 50 milligrams every morning for a couple of years now. I love it. Yeah. I feel like it's really improved my health, my vitality. I never used to be a morning person. I feel like it's really kind of kickstarted my circadian rhythms. So I'm a huge fan of that. And then when I saw that this study used 50 milligrams, I'm like, holy crap. So I recommend it quite frequently. Do you see any downside?
I like DHEA. Let's talk about DHEA for a second. And by the way, Biotics, you mentioned that's a great company if you want to get a good quality DHEA. There are many other companies. But 25 to 50 milligrams is probably a reasonable dose in men. There have been large meta-analyses on men taking DHEA. So what I can tell you is that it's safe if you look at the risk-benefit as sort of borne out by large studies and studies of studies. So 1, it's probably safe. 2, there's enough studies suggesting a potential benefit that it seems like it probably should be in the arsenal for men and women, particularly if there's a noted decline in DHEA. And there's particular contexts where DHEA is seriously an interesting and good idea. And let me lay out a couple. There's been a lot of studies looking at the collateral catabolic effects of taking drugs like prednisone. So let's say you have rheumatoid arthritis, as a classic example, and your rheumatologist gives you a lot of prednisone because your joints are all inflamed and you're just going downhill. If you take DHEA at the same time, you reduce the collateral damage to your bone density if you take DHEA to some extent. So you can mitigate the negative effect of being on steroids in the context of a lot of chronic disease that requires steroid use. Maybe you have really bad asthma and you need to do prednisone taper a couple times a year. Maybe you're getting a lot of steroid injections in your spine because you have arthritis or degenerative disc disease or herniated disc or whatever, or you have rheumatoid arthritis. So anyway, there's a really interesting clinical context there to preserve and protect. If you look at the adrenal gland, you know, you make cortisol in the cortex, you make DHEA in the medulla. These hormones are meant to be sort of used in concert, and they have a yin-yang kind of effect in the body. And we become a little more catabolic with age anyway, so why not sort of balance that out with sort of these anabolic substances? And DHEA really has no downside. I have seen in a couple clinical cases it increased estrogen, but estrogen is not always a bad thing in men, and we could talk for 10 hours on that topic. Long story short there is, don't lower your estrogen to zero. That's a terrible idea, men out there.
A lot of men.
I like DHEA. I take it personally, and I take 25 milligrams a day. But I think I like DHEA levels to be around 200, you know, give or take.
Nice.
But again, I think the research is pretty solid on DHEA, and the fact that it's over the counter is quite fascinating. You know, it's not in Canada. You probably know that.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It's sort of regulated to a higher degree there. But yeah, this is an anabolic over-the-counter hormone that you know, has good research on it. And interestingly, they used it in this study. I think they used it to attenuate the expected rise in insulin that's caused by human growth hormone use, and they used a fairly good dose of growth hormone. So, but maybe they used it also because it can affect thymic function. And if anybody can answer that question for me, I'd love to hear the answer. But I think DHEA has a positive effect on the immune system, and they were looking to increase immune function in that study.
Yeah, I read some of the references that were listed in that, and that was part of the impetus for that.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah, in addition to the purported increase in dysglycemia induced from the HGH, but that's part of why metformin was in there too. Yeah, so interestingly,
Right.
they cited a bunch of really interesting papers in elderly subjects and looking at parameters of you know, the inflammation, inflammaging, age-associated increase in inflammation and immunosenescence that you alluded to. So
So what did you see on DHEA? Did it in some of the studies, did it decrease a particular thing? I know there's a study in women taking corticosteroids where DHEA improved bone density about 3%. There's some positive cardiovascular studies in men going back several years now, but it helps certain markers of cardiovascular function in guys.
I think there was, they looked at different cytokines, even all-cause mortality. I mean, the data on, you know, in the aging population, there's a ton of research on DHEA.
Totally.
I was blown away. I'm like, I could get my parents on this.
Let me state it this way. DHEA, if the level declines, a low level of DHEA increases your risk of all-cause mortality. So if you have a low level of DHEA chronically, and you're like 30 or 40, be worried, because every study that shows that highlights an increased risk of all-cause mortality. And one of the reasons is DHEA, as an adrenally producing hormone, is a surrogate into the stress resiliency of an organism, much like heart rate variability. So you know, if you have very poor heart rate variability, surgical outcomes are very bad. Resiliency to stress is so bad that literally any stressor in the environment can throw you over to death, basically. So a picture of strong resilience, usually the surrogate markers for that are robust DHEA, good sleep architecture, and things like heart rate variability. Of course, you have a good balance between parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system if you're well adapted to stress. If you haven't overtrained or you haven't overstressed yourself. So I like DHEA as just kind of a, hey, how is this organism overstressed? Understressed? Again, we talk about hormesis, like where are we on this bell-shaped stress curve as it relates to endocrine, to, you know, TOR, to AMPK, to metabolism, you know. We didn't talk about the microbiome much, but I think there's a lot of interrelationship with a lot of the topics covered in this and the microbiome, for example, fasting. And fasting mimicking actually, to an even higher extent, increases mucosal stem cell activity.
Wow.
And there's Longo published 2 papers this year on fasting mimicking and huge increase in mucosal stem cells. So you're trying to heal leaky gut.
Right.
Fasting mimicking, intermittent fasting. Obviously, there's a lot of healthy diets that can increase, you know, bovine immunoglobulins, probiotics, etc.
But see, yeah, I mean, fasting seems like a natural, it's bowel rest, right? I mean, what a great way to, and some of the diversity and different Acromyzium, eosinophilia, and these different bugs that are increased with fasting, I mean, it's pretty fascinating. So, but we have this emotional, I think a lot of people have undiagnosed or just food addictions, right? And so it's really hard. It's part of our culture. It's very social. So I just tell people, look, just compress your feeding window, just like eat a major meal with your family or do whatever, but then that being said, there's all these early time restricted feeding studies showing enhanced autophagy. So I think people get so confused because you say,
and what model is it, right? So is it are they looking at C. elegans, or are they looking at a mouse or a monkey or a dog or a human? And before I sort of developed a science background and training, I didn't really know how to digest a lot of this stuff. But I think put through the lens of having an understanding of the hierarchy of objective evidence is good. Mm-hmm. And again, that is small cell studies, in vitro, which is petri dish, then you get into animal studies, then you get into human studies finally, then you get into studies of human studies of meta-analyses, and then you start to converge on the truth. All scientific inquiry is an attempt to get toward the truth, and you get closer to the truth as you go up in this hierarchy of objective evidence, and we all want to get excited about a million new things. I think we're in a culture and time when the information, it's the cart before the horse phenomenon, and a lot of the cart before the horse stuff is interesting and relevant, and we should use it all. But but it's like we got to temper it with kind of like let's get a little more objective. Let's scrutinize things, especially if we're gonna. And also, I think there's something to be said for consistency. One thing about blue zones, getting back to that, is these are cultures that consistently do the same thing for 100 years. What are we most guilty of in the U.S.? It's doing something different every day. Mm-hmm. Oh, I did keto. Oh, then I tried raw foods. Oh, then I did the carnivore diet. Oh, I used to do CrossFit. Now I do yoga. Now I do spin class. Oh, I slept 2 hours a night. Now I sleep 12 hours a night. Now I nap every day. Now I sauna. And it's just like, jeez.
Yeah, no, you're right.
We're like, how about just like having a backdrop of the 3 or 4 things we do consistently that have like the best evidence, and then play around a little bit based on the individual things that probably would benefit that person. Of course, everybody's different too, right?
Yeah, inconsistency and then lack of objective biomarkers to look at, right? So I think it is,
intermittent fasting, for example, may not be good for everybody. I'll give you one example. Going back to the cell in the ocean, growing and dividing is great when there's nutrient availability. What might be a context where fasting is really bad for humans?
Pregnancy, breastfeeding.
You're in, let's say, here's a good example. You're a woman who can't achieve conception, and you're reading all these things online, and you're thinking to yourself, God, intermittent fasting is so good, and I'm having fertility problems. I'm going to fast.
I'm doing OMAD now.
But you just don't know what you don't know. And then you're like, oh my God, now I'm replicating the stress of an organism who's primarily interested in protecting DNA and recycling nutrients versus procreating. Yeah. In fact, there is drug development now to activate mTOR in the ovary through an injection that would help fertility. So it's the opposite of what we're talking about in a different context. Yeah. Keto in the wrong context. And you know this, but there's certain types of colorectal cancers and melanomas that apparently eat ketones for breakfast. So if you have that type of cancer, probably don't do a keto diet, right? Yeah. It's not globally good for all cancers. So there's a lot of nuance with this stuff. So don't take everything as gospel for everybody and everything. There's an individual context, which is largely missed by people who don't get the opportunity to work with clinicians who might be able to recognize a context for that person that may not be appropriate. You mentioned, let's say, anorexia, bulimia. That fasting is really pretty much contraindicated for those folks. If you're under 100 pounds, don't fast. It's too much of a stress. You're on this end of the hormetic stress curve.
Or if you're trying to build muscle. I get questions from young men all the time. I want to put on muscle. I'm doing 1 meal a day. It's like, don't do 1 meal a day. Why would you want to do it? Like, that's really good for longevity. That's good for weight loss. That's good for diabetes. But I think context is important. So I love that you're highlighting that because we talk about that all the time.
I'm an individual medicine guy. I think you got to globally see the interest level, but then say, okay, but for me, like I'm thin, right? I have a pretty low body fat. When I do often, I've done 8 rounds of the fasting mimicking diet. When I do that, if I'm a little thinner than normal going into that, I do feel like it's a little too stressful on my body, So again, it's context is everything, and really getting a better understanding of where there's better levels of evidence. Like, are you going to spend $50 a month on this, or do a sauna 3 days a week? Let's figure it out.
Yeah.
For you, maybe it's an hour walking a day is better than taking Metformin. I don't know. But I think a good clinician hopefully can take that 30,000 foot view for each patient and be like, okay, for you, here's what I think is going to move the needle the most. And we can now prove it.
Test it.
And test it.
Which is great. So you do some consults virtually, right, Jeff?
We do, and there's an evolving number of states that I'm licensed in, but we do. But primarily my work is done in person here in Portland, Oregon. So people interested in the things we do, BioLounge PDX is the best way to connect with us, become a new patient, etc. I also have an amazing master's level trained functional medicine nutritionist here who's into all the same stuff that we're into.
That's cool.
So
and
we
you
got
do
some
IVs
nice
as
resources.
well.
Yeah, thanks for that. We do IV therapy. My good friend Stephen Harris delivers our IVs. He's an ER nurse, so we do IV vitamins, minerals. We do a lot of iron because we have a lot of anemic and borderline anemic patients, as well as NAD and magnesium and vitamin C and things like that.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's a great clinic. This is the Northwest, you say?
Yeah, we're in the Northwest 23rd area of Portland, which is basically downtown, a Pearl kind of adjunct, Pearl.
I think this side has the best
area.
food, I feel like. Yeah, bamboo sushi, you have all this. In the fall, it's so beautiful, like 23rd Street in particular.
Yeah, I mean, your audience you cast a wide net, so for people who have not been to this part of the country, it's very lush, very beautiful. Lots of rain, but a lot of trees, an amazing food and health culture. We have chiropractic college, 2 places in town to get oriental medicine degrees. You have a naturopathic college, which is the oldest one in the United States. You have several nurse practitioner programs, a PA program, and a OHSU, which has a medical school as well. So we're a very rich sort of subculture around health, wellness. I think there's something like 400 naturopaths in Portland.
Wow.
I'm a nurse practitioner by training, but I became interested in anti-aging 10 years ago, so I did a board certification and fellowship in anti-aging functional regenerative medicine. But basically, long story short is Portland is a great place for food and wellness, I would say, and also outdoors, great hiking and biking.
It's a beautiful city.
Yeah.
I like it. It's grown so much in the last 5 years. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, don't come here. No, just kidding. There's a lot more traffic than there used to be, but rightfully so. This is a great place to live with a high quality of life, so we love it.
That's awesome. Jeff, it's always great to talk with you. I'll put links to your clinic and website and past interviews that we did, which is amazing. But final question here. So out of all the things we talked about, if someone said, hey, look, I'll give you a lifetime supply of just one thing, rapamycin, berberine, whatever, NMN, NR, what are you going with right now? To enhance longevity and maybe stave off age-related disease?
I think, it's a great question. It's always hard to answer these types of questions, but I love the question. I think the thing that I've done most consistently over the last 2 years after being sort of inundated with new information about all these pathways and how to exploit them and so forth, which I also think is a very practical application that's very safe for a lot of people, is the application of fasting using the 5-day fasting mimicking diet. I mean, honestly, and again, my clinical experience is such that we've done that program for about 300 people. I've done it 8 times. I've looked at biomarkers in patients who've done this. And I think some derivation of prolonged fasting done maybe quarterly or 2 or 3 times a year has pretty darn good human clinical evidence that it reverses most of the relevant markers that are associated with chronic disease, and probably activates autophagy and certainly increases stem cell activity while lowering glucose. And again, if we're talking about relevancy, so if I'm on a desert island, I may have a different answer to this personally, but I think if the average person in the country is on a desert island and I can give them one tool that they can do just simply 4 times a year to extend lifespan, health span, and reverse the onset or prevent the onset of chronic disease, it's going to be probably a fasting mimicking diet.
Yeah.
And I think people have wavered in their enthusiasm for these things. There's always something new and there's something more exciting. But I think, if you look at evolution and everything else, fasting, however you do it, is cheap, it's safe,
Available to everyone, pretty much.
There are easier ways to do it.
Yeah.
Again, whether it's intermittent fasting or something like Prolon, the 5-day fasting mimicking diet. So I'm going to go with that for now.
Do you do that once a quarter, personally?
Yeah. So just to put myself on the spotlight here, I did my first round in March of 2018, and I've done 7 since, plus a 3-day water fast. So basically fasted 8 times in the last 2 years, well, less than 2 years. And it's been pretty powerful, I have a lot of conditions in my own body that benefit from fasting, and I've seen a lot of benefit to what I deal with physically. There's an autoimmune disease in my body called ankylosing spondylitis, which, if left unchecked, causes my whole spine to fuse together. My whole body would turn into a lump. It would be a rock. I wouldn't be able to, walk or move or anything.
Wow.
So fasting attenuates, the trajectory of that disease process. And fasting is probably also beneficial in the context of a lot of autoimmune disease. So my personal interest in fasting is based on autoimmune disease, but the relevancy for the average person in the United States, I think, is cardio-metabolic disease and extension of lifespan and health span.
I didn't know that about you. So what biomarkers do you track for that? Is there different...
So C-reactive protein is good. I can also do interleukin 6 now through Quest.
Yeah.
Those are the main ones I would, for me, but I can feel it. I mean, my process is so acute when it comes on that it's like, is the inflammation there or is it gone? If it's gone, I know something had a positive effect on it.
So if you're not eating right, not sleeping right, drinking too much, whatever, you get stiff, and then after a fast or a fasting mimicking diet.
I'm in my 40s now, but I was diagnosed with this disorder at age 19, and at age 19 I did my first 9-day fast. And so since then, for over 20 years, I've been dabbling in fasting. It's only in the last 2 years that I've had an appreciation for the mechanisms. And it has a lot to do with autophagy, getting rid of senescent cells. Probably this increase in intestinal stem cells is beneficial in the context of autoimmune disease. And by avoiding food for a few days, you're avoiding a potential inflammatory trigger. Again, diet affects inflammation. In my case, high starch foods are a big trigger, as well as gluten, for example. Yeah. Everybody's a little different there, but yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, Johns Hopkins, Mark Mattson, I think one of the first alternate day fasting studies was looking at asthma symptoms in overweight individuals. So it's funny that the whole fasting trend is being now applied for cardiometabolic disease, but it was first kind of looked at in an autoimmune inflammatory situation. And not too many people make that association. So anyway, I think it's pretty fascinating. But Jeff, really appreciate you coming on. So grateful that all of you are still here, and I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you did, and definitely check out Bio Lounge PDX. And if you're in the Portland area, come in and you have a big area where people can buy stuff and check things out and get an IV and hang out with Jeff. So
thank you, Mike, so much. Always a pleasure to talk with you. Really dynamic, fun conversation. So thanks for doing what you do.
Yeah, thank you.